a great way to close it. I'm Kirsten Casey. I'm the Poet Laureate of Nevada County, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Rooja tonight. I'm just going to read a little thing that I wrote. Some of it's obvious, it's in her bio, but there's other stuff. Rooja is a 2022 McDowell Fellow, a graduate at Pacific University MFA program, and her debut collection, which if you haven't read, please purchase it tonight. It's gorgeous. Rooja's work not only illuminates her experience as a female growing up in Iran, but connects her readers directly to it. It is a memoir in verse. Language is a powerful time machine. The threat of violence and the presence of war all inform her authentic, stunning recollections. Sin, displacement, and silence were part of her heritage, but her poetry is atmospheric, bold, intimate, and revealing. The joy and innocence of childhood contrast powerfully with the juxtaposing lack of women's rights, the absence of freedom of expression, and her own displacement. Her voice is informed by this, allowing her to capture the loneliness of exile and religious expectations. She always feels on the brink of something. Rooja's uncanny sense of place, combined with the richness of her culture and her mother tongue, compel the reader along the journey of what is embedded and carried within her. Family, country, identity, grief, beauty, unceasing connection, and ultimately healing. Rooja's poetic responses to her uncle Rooja Mohassess's paintings furthers that relationship with the past, honoring him and adding her own singular perspective. Though much of his work is gone, through her ekphrastic poetry, his work lives on. Now it is our turn to be intoxicated by verses written by Rooja. She is not afraid to speak the truth, and she speaks it so well. Please welcome Rooja Mohassessy.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that introduction. It's very moving for me to hear about my uncle's work living on. Thank you, appreciate it. So usually these days I've been starting my readings with a new poem that's not in my collection. That is a poem that is in response to the women-led uprisings in Iran. That is still ongoing, though it's changing shape and form. These days, what the women, if you have been following, you know that they executed 4 people, and ever since that, the protests have died down a bit. But it is still ongoing, and it's changing form in that women are actually going out into public spaces without their head coverings, and that's the form of protest, which is a form of civil disobedience, and it's working really well. And of course, they're putting their lives at great danger by doing that, because there have been instances of acid being thrown in their faces, and also, of course, if any sort of venue where a woman shows up without her head covering actually gets closed, shut down very quickly. So it is a form of protest that I think is powerful, and the government is cracking down, but I think it is succeeding, and I'm hopeful. And so this poem here is a poem I wrote early on after the death of Mahsa Amini, and it's called Zan Zendegi Azadi, which translates into woman, life, freedom. Zan Zendegi Azadi, a plea for the ends of our daughter's hair and imported tubs of dye by our bathroom sinks, promising Western overtones in violet and blue, for our interrupted narrative where sunbeams still remember the ritual of reaching through a window to catch the careless toss of a handful of hair out of a face. For highlights, growing out in tension and mistrust at the same ordinary pace as elsewhere. For our roots, pounded with surahs and solemnity, pinned and pressed to grow yet lie in place under the imam's benediction, our shelter from the imperialist threat. when really all our daughters need is a little diversion, same as elsewhere, volume, the cheerfulness of henna, the stripping bleach of an influencer, to be seen on TikTok, Botox, notwithstanding the dark and tweets and the chirping discontent and filtered static. Tonight, we feed our men lavash, pane sabzi, daughters refuse supper and walk away, turning their backs on the goldfish that swim for their reflections crossing the dusk of courtyards where heavy-hearted the pomegranates crack and wash the autumn light in ablution. Tonight, at every street corner perches a wide-angle gaze boring into flesh. .68 caliber paint, plastic pellets, ammunition, cudgels are made halal tonight. Heaven ordained to arrive from Sharq, Gharb, the four directions, made halal tonight. In this twilight, before and after the Maghrib prayer, beatings will be halal tonight. Surveillance cameras roll and note the degree of coverage, the wantonness of our girls whirling in Western ways, flames devouring scarves, the imported purple, neon, crazed ends of millennial hair gawking in lipstick pink. Tonight, the mobile phones held high by a chain of sons corralled to document, a midriff bared on the pavement, the panic, pinch tips of two petite dunes, pre-adolescents, braless, and blood flowing unrestrainable into a pattern before she had a chance to bleed and be kissed on one cheek, then the other, by us mothers, her aunts, great aunts, before Madar Jan had the chance to brush her clean-washed bangs out of her eyes, kiss her forehead, and compliment her for coming of age. Thank you. So I'm going to read some poems from this collection. And it turned out to be a memoir in verse, sort of a memoir, even though I have to say I tried really hard not to write a memoir and tried to keep my private life private. But I guess I came to realize, in fact, the idea of privacy when it comes to poetry is really, there is no such thing. I think it doesn't really exist. I mean, the poetic conversation so much, that is out there has already been said. And so there's really, I'm not saying anything new. I don't feel like my story is anything new or unique. It's a coming of age story, and I just felt that I needed to write what needed writing. And of course, there are many women who have done that. We have so many wonderful, women who have set the stage for us and given us permission to do this. And so someone, eventually when I put the poems together, someone, Shara McCullum, in fact, she said, well, you have a memoir in verse here. And I said, oh no, really? And now I'm fine with it, it's fine. So the first poem I'm going to read is the one that you just mentioned, Intoxicated by Verses. And it's a poem about my childhood of being, I was a very devout child. No one in my family was particularly devout except my grandmother. And I loved my grandmother. There are many poems in this collection about her, and the collection is dedicated to her. And so I would pray with her, since nobody else prayed. And praying for Muslims meant you pray 3 times a day. It's actually takes quite a bit of time to pray. It's a big chunk of your day. And there was I remember this one instance where I was, I think, 9 or 10 or so. And I was praying, and I had such an ecstatic experience, and it was so amazing. How this kind of religious experience you see in these Renaissance paintings of, women just martyrs and stuff. It was that kind of thing. And I was 10, and you recite the Quran in Arabic. And Iranians, Persians, we don't speak Arabic. We speak Persian. And the Quran you're not allowed to translate it. So I would be reciting these verses in Arabic, in a language that I did not understand, and I had no clue what I was saying. But what always still stuns me is how the religious experience is not reliant on words. And, you know, and I was having this incredible moment. And so the poem is partly about that, but it's also partly about the brainwashing that had started to be that had started to set in after the change of the regime in Iran, which was after the 1978-79 revolution. The Islamic Republic was, you know, set in place, and it's still there now after 45 years. And so it's kind of it has many layers, this poem. And I should say that the poems, about 90% of them are ekphrastic. They're inspired by the art of my late uncle, Rooja Mohassessy, who was a prominent Iranian painter and sculptor. He passed away in 2010, but he is a very well-known figure in Iran and also out of Iran. He's often called the Persian Picasso. He is the father of modern art. And as Kirsten mentioned, he did destroy most of his art, mainly because he did not want it to fall into the hands of the Iranian government, a regime that he was bisexual. There was quite a bit of nudity to his art. And the change of regime really derailed his career. He was no longer able to go back. He used to work for the Queen of Iran, who was a great lover of the arts, and she gave him commissions to make art, especially like great, larger than life-size sculptures for public places in Iran. Like there was one of his beautiful sculptures called the Flute Player that was in the city theater in Tehran, and a sculpture with an erection. And after the revolution, they took it down and they cut it up, which is really, you know, heartbreaking. But from what I understand, they cut it up, but it is somewhere in the basement of some place in Tehran. And so my hopes, I always say, is that I will be alive the day that that sculpture will be restored to its original place. But if you would like to get a sense of the artwork, you can now or later. If you go onto my website, be just Rooja Mohassessy, onto the gallery page, I have uploaded all the artwork that has inspired this book. And so each piece of art is paired up with its image on the gallery page. And so that you'll see the title of the poem and the artwork that inspired it, if you're interested. And the cover is one of his collages. So what I do have that I have used for this collection are the small works of paper collages. They're often very small, that he was doing towards the end of his life when he was ill and no longer really able to paint and sculpt. And he would just, out of this magazine that he would get on a weekly basis, it was called Corriere della Sera. It's Italians, they always get this magazine. And he would just cut collages out. And he would also often tell me that, because he was not well and his hands shook, but when he came to cutting, he had the steadiest hand when he would cut a piece of, you know, something. And I thought that it was a little bit like what Michelangelo says, that art is cutting away the unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And that is the way I saw him, you know, he would see something in this magazine paper and he would cut it out. And suddenly out of a Louis Vuitton bag, you had a fish. Mm-hmm. And it was just so inspiring. And I love ekphrastic work, because I think you are using somebody else's vision as a muse. And especially if you love their work, right? There needs to be that emotional connection, some kind of an emotional connection. And so I think it's already, I guess it makes, as an artist, you're part of a conversation. You're contributing when you are starting. And I know here there are so many poets who love the ekphrastic form. And for me, it was a way of mourning my uncle's loss. It took me many years to realize the tragedy that his life had turned into. And I was not, even though I grew up with him, I lived with him, I was a child, I was not quite aware that I was living with such a great figure. And I was also not aware at the time of the sorrow that he was carrying. And it took me many years to come to terms with it and to realize it. And it was sort of, the grief was overwhelming, grief and depression. And so this project for me has been a way of healing, of acknowledging that we are really pawns in this great, huge, often very patriarchal political situations and changes that affect us ordinary people, and sometimes extraordinary people like my uncle. We're really, I think that is what Kirsten was saying, it's a sin. At least that's how I look at it, and I cannot forgive what they have done, what they did to his life. So I'm going to start with this poem, Intoxicated by Verses. Even the Farsi translation, the barely legible print beneath each calligraphed line calls for translation. How scholarly she is at 10, squatting, cross-legged, hunched over the book of spells she spreads daily on her knees. Thou shalt not touch the verses. With the full length of her arm, she turns each page from one corner of the magic world to the next, careful not to scare the sacred, the gilded accents, little blades suspended, twinkling over the cursive script. Thou shalt not recite in a foreign tongue. She loves the Arab tongue of God. She loves her lips sliced with surahs, the consonants he thrusts to the back of her throat, the long vowels he sustains on her breath, her incantations soar, her white chador, a floating tent sewn, sunny with daisies, beaming with childhood. She pauses to drink at the turquoise bank. The hand-painted margin of the page hems her faith and brims with embossed blossoms. Then dervish-like, rocking with each Sibylline verse that rises out of her pliant throat, she is the reverberating masjid dome. Poised over her paisley janamaz, birds of praise come nesting. They come cooing, darting out and into her chador, each surah the utterly incomprehensible spell. She incants from her proud minaret, her cupped hands an invitation for God to join her, dance with her on the naked waters of her childhood. Before long, dancing too shall be forbidden. She's my number one fan here.
She is.
I always try to bring her. This next one here is from my grandmother. And so I used to pray with her. And in Iran, the weekends, they're really only a one-day weekend, not a two-day weekend. I think that has not changed. And that's a Friday. So Friday is the day off. And so Thursday after school, the weekend begins and you have Friday off. And I always, look forward to going to her house Thursday and spending the Friday, and especially during Ramazan, because it's exciting time. She would get up early in the morning before dawn, and you'd have a special meal and then pray. And so I begged her for years to fast with her, and every year she said no, no, no. And then eventually, I think I was about 10, and she kept saying, no, children cannot fast. And I think I was 10, and she said, okay, well, you can fast half a day. And then she would come and, just sort of wake me up, and hoping I wouldn't get up, she'd just poke me a little bit. And so this is, and then one day I fasted with her, this half-day fast, and I went out to play with the neighbors, and I forgot that I was fasting. Kind of weird that you can actually do that if you're fasting. And then I forgot I was fasting, and I got thirsty, and I drank a tall glass of water. And then I remembered, and I went and I said, I drank some water. She said, well, if you forget, it doesn't count. God doesn't mind. And she lived in the north of Tehran, a beautiful area by the Alborz Mountains. And so there was it was on elevation, lots of slopes to get to her, and there was often snow there. We would get snowed in sometimes, and I'd hope that there'd be no school the following. Ramazan in Tajrish, for Mother. You nudged me with a whisper to rise an hour before Azan from under the thick of dove feathers, warm with your love for God and me, the musty grandchild who had rushed the weekdays to arrive at you, and you were already more in love and old, like walnut trees. Little did I understand of the hours past the shuffle of shadows, why they felt solicitous, safe only at your home, like uncles who dropped their manliness at your door, removed their shoes, and stooped through the narrow frame to greet you. Whether I hurried out of your bed to meet God at my paisley prayer mat, the cotton janamas you hemmed by hand, or to putter after you out and into sunlit rooms was moot. Little did I understand of the prayer in your gate for the faint, dehydrated child. The afternoon hours ran from the setting sun, while your white chador shifted faithfully about you, sprinkled with flowers, deferential with the remaining minutes. Though too young to fast, even then I knew, when I pestered you with a 10-year-old's dogged demands to rouse me for Sahari, the day-old lavash we tore like a promise between us, buttered at near dawn, and to keep our secret from Mama and Baba. I knew in your low-cloud voice that would nudge my sleeping cheek only once. Did you think I would not hear you? In the reluctance of it lodged the caress of those childhood days.
Yeah.
That one's for all the mothers and grandmothers that we love.
Mama, Baba, Mom, Dad.
Mama and Baba means mom and dad. We had to keep it a secret from them because my parents did not want me to fast. Like, just don't tell them. This next poem is one of the first poems that I got published. It's a short one, and it's about the war. After I was a child in back in Iran during I was there for the 1978-79 revolution that I already mentioned, and a year after the revolution, the Iran-Iraq war started. That lasted 8 years. And I was there for the first 4 years of the war. And there was a period there during the war where Iran and Iraq, both countries, were bombing the cities. And so we would be told, like today, the bombers would be coming and electricity would be cut off, and we'd go into the basements and things. And one time there was a bullet that came flying through my bedroom window. Fortunately, I was not there at my desk, but the desk was here and the window was here. And we cross-taped, as it's done at wartime. You cross-tape all the windows so they don't shatter. And this bullet had come and entered and grazed, passed through the door and grazed the column in the house. And we couldn't find this bullet. We looked for it for several weeks. And finally, we found it in a corner. But this is a poem in memory of those moments. Because once I left Iran, it was, for me, a very traumatic experience, because I think the environment that I had grown up in Iran was so at odds with the Western environment that I suddenly found myself in. So many of the expectations, the cultural expectations, the mores of my upbringing was just, I could not reconcile the two worlds. And so, and I think that is something that is common, from what I understand, for displaced people, where they have to leave a part of themselves behind to move on and survive and adapt. And so for me, it meant forgetting or effacing or sort of blocking out my childhood. I no longer could be that person. And so a part of my healing process was to go back and try to retrieve as much as I could about my childhood. And I would often, and I did that with this process of looking at my uncle's work and trying to remember my childhood. And I would really get hold of tiny little gems of memory. And I would then build it into a poem. And so this is one of those moments. Curious the things that we remember, right? Childhood. Juliet, the dice was loaded from the start. Mark Knopfler. Frightened, my childhood refused to attend my life, though I invited it repeatedly. Shy and broken, it handed me shards I dusted off, demonstrating how to assess the depth before easing into pain. I blew on its sore eyes, resorted to lies. Your desk, I said, and the imploded hole to your right on the cross-taped window will still be here, sparkling like the stars above when you return. Meanwhile, I promised, I'll continue to search for the bullet lost in the house. I wrote this poem probably about 5 years ago. I think it took me a very, very long time to find my voice. I mean, I feel like I've always had poetry. I feel like I have poetry in my blood. I grew up reading poetry, reading Hafiz, and the moments I remember of any sort of class, as a child, this has to do either with poetry or when the teacher scolded me. Those are the only things I remember. But I remember the images mainly that poems evoked, and then I think the immigration process, as I said, for me was just difficult for someone of my sensitivity and sensibility. And so I think I was depressed for many years and really voiceless, even though on the surface I looked like, I functioned. But I think emotionally and psychologically, I was not okay. And so I think poetry, it sounds cliche, but has really been my way of healing and just acknowledging that my story matters, because I think a part of lacking a sense of belonging is that you really retreat into the shadows as a person. You try, as an immigrant, you try very, very hard not to be noticed, not to be seen. And so, right. I mean, to come to this book at this stage in my life, I just feel it's a privilege. Anytime. Thank you for that question. There must be a better way for me to find out what I'm reading next. So this next poem is about the moment that I stepped off the plane when I left Iran during the war. The Immigrant and Skin. We'd landed, and on our way to the terminal, I lost myself to a foulard. It toyed in the lenient light of the bus with garden green, then chartreuse. It made no qualm, straight no part of the young woman in order or out of deference, no proper plan in particular. I watched it dip into her cleavage, gradually slip off the curb of one shoulder, as though teased by the jolts on the road. She'd left her throat bare, unaware of the tiny tremors rolling with the sip of Evian and the moist syllables that cohered, her breath there, very near her travel companion. We were many, our long censored eyes now privy to titillation and play. I, the prepubescent voyeuse, transported by the rippling, the recline of her head, tugged as if in jest by the world ends, a tight crowd mingling in the small of her back. I watched the lovers' heads dovetailed, a dome sparkling by the window like the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad. Then the noise that pealed from the forward thrust of her throat and seized her rouged mouth, delayed, tilted like a goldfish come to feed. A mouth like that would have been taped back home. I had no doubt, without questioning, with or without lipstick. I reached for the nape of my neck, pared by the open air. This next poem is my, I call it my silly attempt at assimilating into Western culture. I need a sip of water for this one. Straniera, which means foreigner in Italian. 2 years into exile and still waiting to fall into place, feel at home in a thong, won't venture out to where she can't touch, heads to the beach daily like homework, wades through a bronzed sea of bodies, splayed under the late summer Ferragosto sun, pursed at the tips, tanned breasts pull languidly to each side like half-filled leather bags. She looks for an empty patch of beach the size of a Janamos, spreads the towel, lies back, luxurious bodies of clouds stretch in white marble gestures of Venus crouching at her back. She rolls onto her belly, undoes the strap, pulls the bikini top from under, firmly pressing her breasts into the heat, the burn of transgression, and turns to bare sandy nipples to the world, though no one is looking. No cupbearer waiting for a sacrificial offering of a swim top. No Roman rite of passage to brave. Clouds carry on, cut across, upstage each other, a low one casts a modest shade, festooned over her, like a clean white chador, fetched from a line. This next one I also need a sip of water for.
What is a chador?
A chador, thank you for asking, I should explain that. It's a garment that covers the entire body, actually, not the face, or you can. It's actually a half circle, and you drape the body with it, and it's a beautiful garment. I used to love to wear the chador. I had ones with lots of flowers on them, and depending on how devout you are. In fact, I have a poem in the book about how the chador becomes weaponized during the regime. The black chador and the way the woman, they wore it. You know, you could see their political inclinations by, they covered the face with it. And once, if they let it go, you could see underneath. They also had another head covering, which meant, it started to be a political statement. And this is why right now you see the women sort of, asking to have a choice in the matter, whether it's not really about the hijab. I have nothing against the hijab. In fact, I think it's a beautiful garment, and it's not particularly just Muslim, right? We see it in all religions, the act of modesty, and it should be a choice. And we often saw it in Iran when I was growing up, that women, they wore their miniskirts and, everything was sort of out on display until they got older. And once they hit 60 or something, suddenly they all turned about, and they would start to cover their hair and read the Quran. And as children, we'd be like, how does that work? Why is it? But so this next poem here is I had a lot of fun writing. It's called First Kiss. I often say I hope yours was a better experience than mine. First Kiss. I wish someone had explained how wide to open for that French kiss, how to keep my front teeth out of his way, angle my nose, breathe, and let the tip of his tongue probe like a feeler. I dodged it to make room, rolled mine into a morsel, nursed it inside a cheek, and swallowed my growing need to spit. If he entered too far, I stifled the gag. When he slid under, I drew back. When he relaxed, it thickened and slugged in my cramped mouth, slushing through the excess saliva. He'd pull away, then quickly resume, kiss me again and again as though he had yet to get what he'd come for. With each brief lull, I came up for air, wiped my mouth, it was very fun writing this, and down the buildup, the hard taste of liquor laced with the scent of a day-old ashtray. I told myself, with time, I'll get this. The way I'd learned to swallow without chewing a tough cut of a sirloin steak. No, I wish someone had explained this was an invitation of sorts. I'd been invited to la danse de langue. I wish he'd curtsied and waited for the first note, accustomed to commence a minuet à deux mouvements. I wish he'd lingered at my lips around the doorway, then bowed a little to enter and greet Marguerite, the pearl of daisies, damp at dawn, not a dandelion, a common sedge, the buck-toothed teen, her breasts only just budding. Oh, I would have looked upon him then with my dark eyes. I would have danced, taken the heat, the burn of the new day, my mouth young, oh, so eager to please. I don't know how it's such a sad poem. In fact, it's really sad. But it's funny also. Right?
Very comfortable.
I have some, not too many, but I have some ranting poems in here. I debated whether to leave them in or take them out, and in the end I decided to leave them in because I realized, they do represent a part of my experience, not the totality of my experience, thankfully, but a part of it. And I'm glad I left them in because when I've been going around on my book tours, and especially if I'm reading at universities to young people, these poems have spoken a lot to them when I ask them, what's your favorite poem? These ones, I think, give them permission to write their rage or, the dark side of their experience. I've asked for it. This, and I should say, I think I've never read this poem before, so we'll see how it goes. I've asked for it. This is how my flesh is made taboo. Desire bears its head, you beat it with the same stick your father raised, imagining you differ from a fanatic who, upon seeing a swallow, prays for the cup to pass from him. He takes no notice of clouds, thin and see-through in the distance of rarefied air, of the respite offered by limbs bowing under the belly of sparrows. You lower your gaze for fear of the open sky, swallow a holy verse like a pill. The orgasm, though, is inevitable. Your frame shakes, each spasm a reason to consign your wife and daughters to a shapeless corner of the room, their hair tied back out of the wind. You cannot help, it jostles its way in, clumsily rude, as the repressed id, which in spite of all efforts won't learn the difference between wife, daughters, and sky. It can't help but crave the flush of dawn, the swift whip of the pixie swallow against its cheek. To remedy this, you escort me to an improper room of your dreams. It's all very heady here. I'm a minor or a married woman whose bare arms belong as yet to no one or someone. In your dream, I'm dirty. I've asked for it, which is fine. But won't you step into the open? Won't you call my name? Don't you see? Here I stand, the fresh air, the slice of blue, the taste of rapture in my mouth. Like that one?
Favorite. Yeah, I think it's a favorite.
And I think this is the last poem that I'm going to read. And this poem also I've never read before, and it's a poem from my father. My parents are deaf-mute, and my father's deafness was particularly hard for the family. And they took him to a holy shrine where the sick are healed, and hoping that he would be healed. And of course he was not. This is a poem. It's about that.
His name.
His name, my father's name. It's the title of the poem. Sivash. Sivash, for my father. Could he have uttered a word at all, he would have cooed into my ear like a rock dove, his mouth a clipped wing, my maimed altar of worship. He would have risen with the gurgle of the radiator at dawn with the first call to prayer. He would have known the clamor of his tools, the chatter of the handsaw, baby teeth nibbling through poplar slabs. Glissando, glissando. It should have been him who heard the sorrel that raised a storm of red sweeping John Wayne across Monument Valley. He should have heard the cowboy dubbed into Farsi on our brand new color TV, the travail of that thoroughbred. He was in love with his bridal throat, unwinded like his own, his breath only just audible. In the absolute silence that corralled him in, let him out and into rooms. He should have heard our pale old pecan. I couldn't tell what ailed it. It lamented of winter, but how was I to sign a car chugging, sighing to a stall into his eyes? It would shiver, unwilling to mount the on-ramp of Sayyid Handan. My father, you were a child of 10. Did you know the purpose of that pilgrimage to Mashhad? They pressed your head against the shrine. You slept through the starless night, your slight ankles fettered to the steely luster of the latticed window. The autumn equinox was burdened with rounds of surahs that night. At daybreak, Hanumjun and Mamanjun broke vigil. Chadors slipping to their shoulders, they whispered, Sivash, Sivash, Sivash. In your ear, against the morning breeze, they called your name, Sivash. The matron saint kept deaf as steel to their pleas, though the two women would have laid their lives at her feet to awaken the dead drums of your ears. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
How many languages do you speak?
I speak 5, but all of them sort of conversationally.
I heard French and Italian.
Right. And I speak Chinese. I lived in China for 13 years.
Have you ever written any poetry in Farsi, in Persian?
No, I have not.
It wouldn't be natural for you.
Just my Farsi is not good enough at this point. Okay.
When you first came to this country, where did you come to?
I didn't come here until I was ready to go to college.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I moved to Europe. I grew up in Europe, and I went to college here in the US, and then I was in China, and then I came back. And very nomadic lifestyle. But I have a home now, and I have fruit trees in the foothills here, which I love. And I think it's the trees that really keep me rooted. The trees and the people, friends. I have a poem called Eggplants that's about my garden there that I usually like to read, but I thought it was too long.
Thank you.
Thank
Rooja.
you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming.